Hi there, everybody. I'm Jason Little, the author of Lean Change Management, and you're watching 7 Ways to Flip Your Thinking Away from Executing Change Tasks and Towards Experimentation. Welcome back to LCMTV. Thank you so much for watching. This episode is about one of the 5 universals of change: experimentation over executing change tasks. And Happy New Year to everybody. So it's January 2nd, 2022, which means most of us have abandoned our New Year's resolutions already. I know lots of people who don't even do New Year's resolutions. They just take the attitude of, well, if there's something I want to change, I'll just change it on the fly when I need to. I'm not going to wait for New Year's. I'm going to be more agile about it. And there's people that really buy into the magic around New Year's. There's just something about that switch over. And it's interesting when I talk about this with my kids, they're just like, who cares? It's just another day. What's the big deal? But some people really get into it's really a good time to take stock in what you're doing and start to experiment more in the new year, shake things up, change things up a little bit. And it just gives people that emotional trigger to be able to try and do things differently. Now, it didn't seem like there was a lot of hype around New Year's as there normally is. So we ended up just kind of closing everything down. We had a situation where one of our kids, the last week of school, was in contact with somebody who tested positive for COVID. So we basically just self-isolated. Not a big deal. Don't really think that we needed to take that extreme thing, but we ended up just closing everything down. We didn't visit any family over the break. We didn't do anything for New Year's. So it could be just my perspective that things seemed a little bit more low key. So we watched a few of the things on TV. No big crowds anywhere, except for in France, where they lit a record number of cars on fire. I think it was 1,136 or something like that. And I didn't realize that was a tradition in France. So I guess, all those folks who are lighting cars on fire in France, you're not allowed to talk about how messed up things are in the US. So I'm glad I live in Canada because we don't light things on fire, except if our team doesn't win the Stanley Cup. Anyway, so let's get this thing back on the rails. This episode is about 7 tips you can use to move away from just executing change tasks and moving towards experimentation. Now, that's one of the 5 universals of change. That's our theme for this month. And you can catch some of the previous episodes where we talk about tips from the previous monthly themes at the links below or right here. So let's get into it. Now, the main idea about experimentation over executing tasks is, I've seen my share of change programs where we spent the $2 million of budget, all the tasks were done, nothing's different. So we get kind of locked into this feeling of false certainty that if we just plan out all the tasks and we execute all the tasks, everything is going to work out. And if we have a high level of uncertainty, we need to experiment more. Now, the problem with experimentation is when Lean Startup came out in 2012 or 2011, it gave us, it's plan, do, check, act, but with 3 steps instead of 4. But it did change how people saw product development. It was, don't spend all of your money and your time building something before you've actually validated people want the solution. And that hit very close to home for me in an organization I was working in. We spent about 1.5 years and $1.5 million building something that we could not sell any licenses for. And that was right about the time where I got bit by the Lean Startup bug, and my team actually won the Lean Startup Machine Toronto contest. And that really got me started down the path of really just being completely enamored with the Lean Startup approach. Now, as kind of things moved along with Lean Startup and it started to become more popular, the phrase experimentation almost seemed like it became an excuse to not be thoughtful. Hey, let's just experiment and we'll see what happens. Let's just be agile and be nimble and all this type of stuff. And it's not an excuse to not be thorough or to be thoughtful. Experimentation is a way to deal with uncertainty. We can't predict the future. We can't know exactly where we're headed. We might know we're going north or east, west, or south, or whatever direction we're headed, but we can't know exactly how it's going to work out, and we have to be able to experiment our way through that. Now, fast forward today, agile change, lean change, whatever you want to call it, is becoming more and more popular, and more organizations are realizing that Experimentation is what they need to move things forward. I'm working with some large organizations that have very, very long, drawn out change cycles. They want to try to experiment and shrink those down because we're bombarded every day with thou shalt change faster. Globalization is increasing, the pace of change is increasing. Now it's the time to do things differently. And really, that type of language has been used for the last number of decades. It's just something that happens in business. The more we compete, the more we create the need for innovation. The more we innovate, the more competition we create. So these are 7 tips or philosophies around experimentation that can help you potentially nudge things forward when your organization gets stuck. Visualization is extremely important with change. Now, when it comes to applying innovative or lean startup or agile practices in a product development context or in a development context, it's easy to see stuff. You get to see software every week or potentially every day, but there's something you can look at, you can latch onto, something tangible you can see. With change, it's more difficult than that. So often we're trying to change hearts and minds. I don't like using the mindset word because I find it's too often used as a stick, as in my mindset is great, yours is not. I have to change you, so I'm going to whack you over the head with this mindset stick until you change your mindset, which is actually fixed mindset thinking, by the way. But the point is, visualization takes what we're doing with change and makes the invisible visible. I've done a few videos on this already, but one of my favorite stories is how a government organization I worked with simply started visualizing a big 3-year modernization program they were doing. And I remember the main program lead sent me an email year and a half into it, and he said he was amazed at how many problems and risks were dealt with because of just visualizing stuff. It also was a really good way to show the leaders that there was a lot more effort, because I think we can oversimplify change sometimes. Let's just train people on this new model or this new method, and we'll measure them towards it, and they'll just go do it. So let's capture the current state, let's create a future state, let's transition, let's manage towards it. What's the big deal? When you start to visualize how things are happening with change, you can actually manage or facilitate through the change much better, because if you can't see the work, you can't manage it. Lean change management has always been about a feedback-driven approach to change. That is, gather insights from the people who are affected by the change, the people who are asking for the change, the intended and unintended consequences, and use that feedback into your planning. So it's not about the plan itself, it's the process and the conversations that happen to create that plan is the most important part. Now, we do kind of get locked into this linear, we have to plan everything out, we have to create all the tasks, and often we create work for ourselves that we don't really need to do. I've seen this so many times in workshops where people who are dedicated change agents or they're consultants that are hired for 5 days a week, 40 hours a week for 6 months, they have to be doing stuff because they have to justify why they're getting paid. And we don't have the luxury of using a feedback approach. We have to use a more push-based approach because people are wanting to know, hey, what are you working on? Why aren't you doing anything? And sometimes we know that change just takes time. And it's that feedback that we want to use to change the change as we're moving along. Now, the key with feedback driven is it doesn't mean you don't plan. It just means you plan more frequently in shorter time horizons, in smaller batches. And really, this depends on how uncertain the change is. Now, if it's transformations, digital transformations, highly complex software rollouts, we might trick ourselves into thinking that they're pretty simple, but they're not. If we're just moving a bunch of printers from the first floor to the second floor, and you've probably noticed I use this moving printer metaphor a lot because I was chatting with someone who said, method X is really good at moving printers, but it sucks at everything else. So when there's lots of certainty, you can just plan everything. You can create a list of tasks and go, but we don't live in that world. We live in a world where change is much more complicated, and we have to be constantly using a push and pull approach and listening to the feedback of the system. And that feedback and those insights is what helps us change the change. We all love measurements, and I remember I was Working in this one transformation, they were doing some liftoff where there were probably a few hundred of us kind of in this big conference room. And one of the leaders was talking about the transformation, and it was such a great speech. I mean, she was really going on about the energy and how excited she was and how great everything was going to be. And then right at the end of the speech, she said, "And it's on my performance scorecard, so it has to work." And I was like, oh, come on. It just kind of killed the whole thing. So we get locked into these measurements. And early on in change, it's impossible to know exactly what those outcome measurements are. You know, I've seen this in the Agile community forever. I mean, I went to an open space, probably 15 or so years ago, and I was asking questions around, why would anybody care how Agile you are if you're not getting outcomes? And I remember I was like outcast from the open space. It was like, you just don't understand Agile. Now everybody's talking about outcomes, and it's pretty obvious, but it's an easy answer. Yes, obviously there's outcomes that we want to get to. But when we flip our view towards diagnostics, we get two things. We get leading indicators instead of lagging indicators, and we get a way to do an early check with fuzzy metrics, if you want to call them that, to just know we're headed in the right direction. So one thing I like to use is Fist of 5, and that is from the core protocols. And you can do this at any level, and it's basically ask people, okay, we've been doing this change for 2 weeks, for a month, whatever the time horizon is, how much better is it from 0 to 5? So 0, it's 10 million times worse and I hate it. 5, it's the greatest thing since sliced bread. And I think we've invented some better things than sliced bread. But it's using a diagnostic that's not tied to a scorecard, that's not tied to a measurement that thou shalt get. It's a way for us to do a quick check to see if we're at least headed in the right direction. Celebrating successes is pretty obvious, but I can't believe how many times we gloss over this. You know, I think we give organizations a bad rap, and we really beat up organizations a lot about how crappy they are. And we really forget about some of these little small things that add up over time. Every organization is trying to do the best that they can with what they've got to try to improve. I remember being in one organization where the team was working on some piece of software that there was a report that took, 5-10 minutes to run in the browser for clients. And they'd done a bunch of troubleshooting, and they realized there was one stored procedure that was just causing the CPU to spike on the database server. And they fixed it, and they increased the performance, 1,200% or something ridiculous, and they got it down to a really small number. And I was like, oh my God, that's huge. Imagine you've got 1,000 clients, and you've reduced this from X to Y. And I remember everybody just glossed over it. The leaders were like, well, why did you make it that bad in the first place? And the people on the teams were just like, yeah, whatever, it's not that big of a deal. We just optimized a stored procedure. And I had to be the cheerleader in the room. I had to really say, hey, no, seriously, stand back and take a look at what this accomplishment is. And something that seems insignificant can add to, once you start to add these things on top of each other, they can be huge benefits. So let's not worry too much about how small the success is. Those are the things that help keep us motivated. I already talked about diagnostics, and yes, the other side of the coin is measurements. There should be a list of both. They should be related somehow, but they should be constantly evolving things. They shouldn't be just static things we do at the beginning, we put on a scorecard, and we don't change, because we will pursue those measurements even if we get to a point where there's a fork in the road and the measurement is going to take us down into the ditch. We're going to go into the ditch, because if that's how we're being measured, that's what we're going to do. I think a friend of mine once said, given the proper incentives, a manager will gladly take the company down to pursue that measurement. And it has nothing to do with the person and their attitude. It's because of how we've created this system. So measurements should be things that should evolve over time. And we want to balance the diagnostics with the measurements. Early on in change, when you've got the most uncertainty, diagnostics are better, because we want to know if we're going in the right direction. Once you start to work yourself through the emergent part of change and you start to realize what it is you actually want to change, then you can attach more measurements on it. But you need a list of both. The key is they shouldn't be a constraint that really narrows the behavior into just one line of tasks or one direction that we're going to follow, and it puts blinders on us because we just want to pursue those measurements. The last thing about measurements is self-measurement. Let's not create these measurements for other people and say, we're going to measure you on these outcomes. Let's use the cascading idea behind OKRs and let people create their own measurements. Ask people, if you were measuring yourself, what would you do? And ask yourself this as the change agent, or even ask this as leaders. How would you measure yourself to know that you're doing the right things or you're being effective? And if you can flip that conversation away from measurement being something that the people asking for the change are going to measure other people's behaviors, which measuring behavior, never do that. It doesn't work. Flip it the other way around and let people rally around a common cause and purpose, which was our theme for last month, and then let them create their own measurements from it. Except failure is a difficult one. So this whole idea of experimentation, fail fast, thou shalt fail in order to learn, it's cute, but incomplete. I remember working in a large organization where one of the leaders was on stage and said, you don't have a license to fail, you have a license to learn. We learn from successes, we learn from failures, we learn from experience. And I'm more of a fan of sometimes things are going to work out exactly the way you thought, sometimes they aren't, and everywhere in between. If we can learn how to wipe the slate clean and just say, hey, you know what, it didn't work out the way we thought, we can get away from that thou shall have to fail to learn. Because some people in organizations, especially the higher up you go, you get people that are just naturally more competitive, and this winning is a thing, right? As much as we don't like to talk about it and we should all collaborate and everything should be great and fluffy and about people, there are people that are highly competitive and they like to win. They want their company to win and they want to beat their competitors. That's a reality in today's business. I'm not saying it's right or wrong. I'm just saying if we get into this, you have to fail to learn, that type of language puts people off right away. So if we can get away from that kind of language and move more towards learning from experience and say, hey, you know what? Let's talk about what would be the worst thing that could happen if this didn't work out the way that we thought. And it just means we haven't figured out the right way yet. And if you want to be, pedantic with the language, yes, we failed. But if you start using that language over and over again, it can be demotivating and it can build a culture of incompetence. Oh, let's just try stuff. Oh, it didn't work. We learned. Let's wipe the slate clean. So flip the language away from just you have to fail to learn. Accept the failure, wipe the slate clean, move on to the next experiment. Our stance is really important when it comes to running experiments. I remember one of my workshops, one of the attendees said, we do experiments, but we don't call it that because leaders, when they hear that word experiment, they hear things explode, and they don't like that. So we do the experiments, we have hypotheses, we have measurements, we have diagnostics, we have all these things. We just don't use that language. So that really talks about the stance of the change agent. And a lot of the times our stance is, well, you have to experiment. That's the new norm. That's the way we do things today if we're going to be more agile or if we're going to be more innovative, and you have to change your mindset. And we forget that a lot of our stance and how we approach change really impacts how people follow us. Sometimes we need to change our stance more towards facilitation. So I know I've been in situations where you kind of get the spidey sense and you know that the path this team is on is probably going to lead them off of a cliff, but sometimes they need to fall off the cliff in order to learn. And you need to step in as a facilitator and try to poke them, but not give them the answer. You rob people of learning if we come in as the change agents and we give them all of the answers and we tell them exactly what they need to do and we tell them what measurements they should use. We need to change our stance and become more change facilitators instead of change managers. So it proves that we're there to help. It switches our attitude and it flips our thinking away from thinking about change as a control thing and more of a support function. Hope you enjoyed these 7 tips for how you can move away from just executing change tasks and more towards experimentation. Remember to like and subscribe. Experimenting is one of the 5 universals of change. And again, you can find links to our previous videos where we've talked about some of the previous themes. And next month, we're going to be talking about co-creation, which will be the 5th in our series of modern change management. So remember to like and subscribe. You get notified when those come out. And if you've got any tips to share about how you've helped people move away from just executing change tasks and towards experimentation, remember to drop those in the comments below, and we'll see you next time.